In today's tutorial, we're going to talk about Spring Session. What is a session on the web? What is Spring Session? And why might you want to reach for it in your next Spring Boot application? What's up, friends? My name is Dan Vega, and those are some of the questions that we will answer in this tutorial. Now, I'm talking about this topic because it came up on a recent episode of the Spring Office Hours podcast. The podcast, you say? Yes, we've turned our live stream into a podcast, and it is now available on all the major podcast platforms. So do me a huge favor and go ahead and subscribe there if you haven't. That way you can get us whether you're in the car on the way to work or on a treadmill or on just a walk to the park. What could be more enjoyable than Spring Office Hours on a podcast? All right, so you might hear about a project like Spring Session and wonder, what is that and why is it beneficial to me in my next application? Well, instead of rambling about it, here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna create a new project. We'll talk about using Spring Security and what the default kind of implementation is out of the box and where Spring Session comes into play. So with that, let's head over to start.spring.io and create a new Spring Boot application. All right, so we're going to create a new project here at start.spring.io. We are going to choose Java as the language, Maven as the build tool, and I'm actually going to select Spring Boot 3.1.orc1. So if you're watching this in the future, you can choose 3.1 or later. I did a video on this previously. The reason I'm choosing this is for the Spring Boot Docker Compose support. We're going to be using Redis later in this example, so we'll take a look at why we might want to use that Docker Compose support as well. So I'm going to fill this out. I'm going to say this is dev.danvega, and we'll call this the let's call it Redis session because we're going to be using Redis today. We're using Java 17 and we'll need a few dependencies. So we're going to start with web. We'll choose web and then we'll go ahead and choose Spring Security. And I'm going to pick another dependency here, which is Spring Session. We'll talk about why we might want that. And in the end, we'll talk about bringing in Redis support. So I'm going to choose the Spring Data Redis support. So let's talk about this real quick. And I want to use these dependencies as the foundation for us starting this application. But what I'm actually going to do is comment out the Spring Session and the Spring Data stuff so we can see what is the default behavior out of the box before we even introduce something like Spring Session. So when we bring Spring Session in, this is the API and the implementation for managing user session information. But there are different store types. We can use things like JDBC or Hazelcast or Mongo. Redis happens to be one of those. So if we go ahead and click this Explore, we'll see that because Redis was something that we selected as a dependency, now it's choosing to bring in Spring Data or Spring Session Data Redis. If we don't choose Redis, you'll see that there's just like a Spring Session core in there. So it's the core fundamentals of what Spring Session does. But because we have Redis, we bring in that support. We also bring in Spring Boot Starter Data Redis, which gives us a lot of the auto configuration stuff. So again, I wanted to select those so we could see what is actually being generated from the application. So what we'll do is we'll generate this. I'll go ahead and open this up in my favorite IDE, which is IntelliJ. You can open it up in whatever IDE or text editor you're most productive in. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and refactor this. I like to rename this to application, and we are good to go. So I'm going to go back into the POM. Again, I want to take out the Redis stuff just for a moment because we don't have Redis set up yet. We'll talk about that in a second. But I just want to have web and security on the class path. So when we talk about the application, we can take a look at kind of the default behavior out of the box, right? So let's do this. Let's start by creating a new controller. We're going to create a Java class. We'll call this home controller. And let's put this in a controller package. And we'll go ahead and say that this is a REST controller. So what I want to do is I want to create, let's do this. Let's create a new public string home. And this is going to return hello. And we're going to return a name in a second. Let's talk about just this. So we are going to have a get mapping for this. So let's say get mapping, and we'll have this. So no matter what, now because we have Spring Security on the class path, by default, everything is going to be locked down. So if we try to go ahead and run the application and go to this home route, it is going to ask us to log in. And by default, it's going to present us with a form login. So this is just kind of the basics of Spring Security, default, secure by default, right? So what I want to take a look at is we can ask for the principal. We can say, hey, who is the person that is logging in here? And when we do that, we can say, go ahead and use the principal and get the name of that principal. So in this case, the default user is user. So we'd have, if we run this, we'd go ahead and have to log in. We'd use some randomly generated password, and we'd go to the home route, and it would say, hello, user. So this is great. But let's go ahead and let's do that. Let's run this application, and I want to show you something. So let's say here is the user's password. So let's go over to the browser, and we got an error. Let's see, we are trying to connect to Redis. Do we still have Redis on the Spring Boot Starter Security, Spring Boot Web? Oh, we did not reload these changes. So yes, it is looking for Redis. Let's go ahead and restart this. And let's head over to the browser and go to localhost 8080. All right, so I'm going to type in user. I'll type in that generated password. I'll log in, and we are now given hello user. So this is great. We're able to log in, but there's a problem here, right? Let's go ahead and open up the DevTools here in Chrome, go over to application, and under cookies, you can see that we've been given a JSession ID. All right, so what is this session ID doing? So by default, HTTP is actually stateless. It doesn't remember state. When you take in a request, we're asking for some request here. We are given a request. The application figures out what that request is and returns a response. It doesn't remember the previous request. It doesn't know what we're going to do next, right? This is the HTTP. The web is really stateless. So how do we manage state across requests? And this is where sessions come in. So a session allows us to say, all right, here's a cookie, here's the session ID for that particular user that you're interested in. Now we can remember what they're doing across requests and go ahead and store values like, does this user prefer dark theme or light theme? What is their nickname that we want to display to them? All these things that we use to customize a user's experience on the web is done through something called a session. Here's the problem though. By default, the session is only going to last so long. And if we go over to our Spring application and restart our application, so we have a new username and a new password. If I go to the localhost 8080, it now says, I don't remember you. And that's because the application server has restarted. So our session is very much tied to the application server, in this case, Tomcat. This is a problem because, again, if we ever have to update our application, we don't want to interrupt our user's experience, right? This is also a problem if you have to horizontally scale. So if we have one server, it's taking in too much traffic and we need to kind of combat that by horizontally scaling our application, then we have different boxes where all of these applications live. And when I visit the application, I'm just taken to, say, a random server. How is it going to remember that session if it's tied to that server and I come back and I get put on a different server, right? And so this is the kind of problem that you'll run into with sessions in a distributed manner, or in this case, just restarting the application. And this is exactly where Spring Session is going to help us. All right, so I'm back in the Spring application. I'm going to come back to my pom.xml and uncomment those things that I commented out earlier. So now this gives us Redis support. So again, I said that we can use different providers. We can use like JDBC, we can use Redis, Mongo. Redis happens to be a key value store that's really fast. And this is one of the great really use cases for Redis. So I'm going to reach for Redis. Now, I don't have Redis installed on my machine. So what am I going to do about that? I could go ahead and set Redis up, but then the next person who downloads this project needs to go ahead and set Redis up as well. What I'm going to do is create a Docker Compose file. So we're going to say docker compose.yaml, and we're going to go ahead and add a Redis image to our Docker Compose file. So I talked about this in a previous tutorial. Again, this is the new Spring Boot Docker Compose support. If you want to take a look at that, I'll leave a link in the description below. So I'm going to set up a version. We're going to call this 3.1. And we need a service, so services, services, and we're going to choose Redis, and we're going to choose an image of Redis Alpine. Let's say Redis Alpine. And then I'm going to go ahead and map some ports. So I'm going to say ports, 6379 is the default, and we're going to map that to 6379. All right, once we have the Docker Compose set up, we can go ahead and add another dependency here, and this is the dependency of Spring Boot Docker Compose, and we're going to bring this in from org springframework.boot. I'm going to go ahead and save that and reload Maven. What this does is when we start our application up, it will see this file by convention and automatically start any containers that we have listed. So in this case, we have Redis listed. Okay, so that's good so far. So what this means is that because of the support that we brought in with Spring Session and Spring Session Data Redis is now that we're going to be managing our session through Redis. So we're going to store our session data in Redis, and ultimately, if we wanted to scale out horizontally, we have one place where we're storing our information, and all of the different servers could access that. We're also adding Spring Boot Starter Data Redis, so this is giving us all the auto configuration with Redis. So I don't need to go into application.properties and set this up at all. It's automatically going to get wired up for us. Okay, so I want to do one more thing just to kind of show off that we're tracking a user's session. So I want to set up a private final string. We'll say string home view count. This is just the name of the variable in the session that I want to track. So we'll call this home view count. And what I want to do is here in this, I want to go ahead and get access to the HTTP session. So I'll say session. And now what I can do is let's create a method. We'll call it increment count. And then we'll pass in the session and the variable name and the attribute that we want to set. In this case, it's home view count, right? So let's go ahead and say, create that method for us. That's private. Okay, now what we can do is, now that we have the session, we can get access to the session variable called home view count. So let's do that. We can say session dot get attribute, and we want to get to the home, get attribute, and we want to get the home view count. And actually we want to get whatever is passed in. So let me call this attribute, because maybe we have another one that we want to track. So I'm going to say get attribute, and then if that is equal to null, so by default that would be null, go ahead and give me 0. Else, go ahead and get the attribute. And I also need to go ahead and cast that to an integer. And let's go ahead and say that this is the home view count. Right? So far, so good. And then once I have that view count, now I can say on the session, I want you to go ahead and set an attribute. And we're going to set that equal to, we got to set the attribute to home view count plus or equal to 1. So we're basically adding 1 to that home view count. So cool. So now what we can do is we can return, let's say, we can have a get mapping for /count, and we can say public string count, and this is going to take in the HTTP session, and we'll call this session. And I just want to return home view count is equal to, and then we'll go ahead and from the session, we'll say get attribute and then the home view count, right? So yeah, not the greatest, but you see an example here of adding something to the session that we can track for this particular user. And then we can hit an endpoint to kind of view that data. Okay, so so far so good. I think that is really all we need. Now, I will talk quickly about one thing. So I'm going to go into my application.properties. So by default, when we use this new support for Spring Boot Docker Compose, the default is to start and stop the container for us. This is great. This is great for like a Postgres database, right? When we're just kind of adding stuff to it and doing something in development and then coming down. But in the instance of, hey, I want a Redis database up to track sessions across restarts, when I restart my application, I don't want to restart my container as well, right? I just want Spring to go ahead and start it up for me. So we can choose to configure the Spring Boot Docker support. So we can say Spring Docker Compose, and we can say that the lifecycle management, and we have a couple of options. So we could say start and stop, that's the default. None, don't start or stop. And what I want is start only. So the first time we start it, it's going to start that Docker container for me, that Redis container. The second time, when I go ahead and stop it, it's not going to stop it. Like I don't want it to bring it down for me because we're storing session data in there. So let's see if this works. We're going to start by restarting our application. Okay, so far so good. We got no errors. Let's go back to the browser. I'm going to clear this out and I'm going to go to the home route. So it's going to ask me for user and password. I'm going to enter that and I'm brought back to here, which says hello user. Now you'll notice a difference. We are not storing a JSession ID. We are storing something called a session. And so we have a value here. So let's go back to the IDE here. I want to take a look at the terminal. So if we look at the terminal, we can see that Docker PS is going to have a container running called Redis. So this is Redis session Redis 1. What we can do from here is run an exec command, and we can say that, hey, on Redis session Redis 1, I want you to run the Redis CLI. And this gives us the ability to look at the Redis database here that is running in the container. One thing I can do is say, give me all the keys. And we see that there is a key for Spring Session, sessions, and then a value. And that value is the corresponding session that is in our application right now. So if we go ahead and go to home and we hit this a bunch of times and we go over to /count, you can see that the view count is 7. It's hard to see because I'm in here, but the view count is 7. So let's go back to our application and restart our application. Okay, so the application restarted and I'm going to refresh this and our view count is still 7. If we go back to home, we are not asked to log in again. So let's go once, twice, 3 times and see what our view count is. And I must have hit that twice. Oh yeah, I did it 3 times plus the landing. So our view count is now increased. So again, this is just showing us that our sessions are not tied to the application server now. Our sessions are tied to Redis. So they're going to survive restarts. They are going to survive the distributed nature of the web once we start to scale horizontally. All right, that's all I got. Spring Session. I wanted to just dive into a little bit of an introduction into what Spring Session was. Because again, I think the Spring ecosystem is really massive. There's so many projects in the ecosystem to solve different problems. And some of the times when you hear a project, you're like, what is that? Do I even need that? Should I care about it? What does it do at a high level before I waste all my time kind of jumping into it? So I hope this gives you kind of a high-level overview of what Spring Session is and when you might need it. Now, I say that in my head with an asterisk. I can't imagine a project where you're using Spring Security where you wouldn't want to pull in Spring Session to manage those session data, unless for whatever reason you were running, obviously, a stateless session. So now that I'm going to say that, I'm going to backtrack and say if you are running something stateless, so securing a REST API with Spring Security, you wouldn't need this. But in any case where you're managing a session, you would probably want to bring this in and take advantage of everything that it gives you. So, hey, if you found value in this, do me a favor, friends, give me those thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and now the podcast. Come on, spring office hours. And as always, happy coding, friends.